Trespasser: The Lost World Jurassic Park is a first-person action-adventure game developed by DreamWorks Interactive and released in 1998 for Windows. Set after the events of the original Lost World movie, the game was intended to be released towards the end of 1997. Set on Saunus Island, also known as Site B by InGen, who used it for the location of a dinosaur breeding facility. So too would Trespasser be used as a testing ground for various interesting development ideas. Unfortunately, after a troubled development, the game would be delayed almost a year, and would have to scale back on many of its ambitious plans. Poor reviews at launch might have been the game's ultimate obituary, if it weren't revived by fans who patched the game out of its barely playable state and into the modern era. Today this can be found on trescom.org, in addition to mods and meticulous documentation on everything about the game, including various development builds and cut content. Unlike many other games considered abandoned and no longer available for purchase, we have a comprehensive amount of information and a clear picture of what the developers intended and why it might have went awry. In 1995, lead designer Austin Grossman and programmer Seamus Blackley left the legendary developer Looking Glass Studios to join the new game development arm of Steven Spielberg's DreamWorks Pictures, DreamWorks Interactive. Seamus had been tinkering with a bipedal model originally intended for Terra Nova Strike Force Centauri, and he'd been trying to market it to various movie animation studios. As luck would have it, this coincided with Spielberg's intentions to create a game to fit into the new Jurassic Park franchise. The pitch was to leverage Seamus Blackley's simulation experience to reproduce both the wonder and horror of the Jurassic Park universe. The focus was intended to be on exploration and puzzle solving by using the game's advanced physics system. In particular, moving things, stacking boxes, and making bridges. When combat would happen, the player approach would be more about fighting away a dangerous animal than triumphing over mounds of fallen foes. 4 ex-Looking Glass employees became part of the project. Programmer Seamus Blackley, designers Austin Grossman and Richard Wyckoff, and programmer Andrew Hayden Grant, who had previously done work for Flight Unlimited and Terra Nova Strike Force Centauri. In an interview, Austin Grossman stated that he felt they were making a game that, quote, is somewhat in the Looking Glass tradition, a rich, immersive 3D world with strong combat and puzzle gameplay, and that he and Seamus Blackley had ruminated for years on how, quote, a fully physics-based engine would be a quantum leap in gameplay. You can also see the Looking Glass design ethos focusing on systems in the original plans for the AI for the dinosaurs. Originally, the dinosaurs were intended to have various states, such as anger, fear, hunger, thirst, and territoriality. This was a time of corridor shooters when FPS games were still emerging from faux 2.5D sprite-based engines into full polygons with only rudimentary AI and physics. The idea of massive outdoor environments with huge roaming creatures that responded to their environment dynamically, pushing aside physical objects too heavy for you to move as they chased you, with Dilophosauruses circling excitedly around their prey, and raptor tribes defending their territories autonomously, was a thrilling new step in the evolution of games. The goal was emergent gameplay, long idealized by developers at Looking Glass Studios as the pinnacle of games development, a playground that responds realistically and spontaneously to your actions. It's a vision that appeals to me still, a living world that respects the agency of the player, and oftentimes even the agency of his foes. As lofty as that goal was, Trespasser would be panned at release, many gaming magazines considering it the worst game of the year. So how did it go wrong? Although some publications praised the visuals, the game ran and played poorly. The unusual control scheme was a source of both annoyance and comedy. I vaguely remember one gaming journalist commenting on how they saw the arm in their nightmares. Richard Wyckoff's post-mortem, which you can read on the GameDeveloper.com website, paints a picture of incredible ambition hamstrung by poor tools, lack of direction, and inadequate planning. Seamus Blackley, on his appearance on the Angry Video Game Nerd YouTube channel, also cited a lack of experience. Issues and awkward bugs around stacking objects would lead to physics puzzles being cut or drastically simplified. Originally, the goal was for dinos to be fully physically modelled, knowing how to sit, stand, and walk, but ultimately the system employed would be similar to that in Terra Nova, in which the creatures interacted with the environment as if propelled on a ball or invisible hamster wheel, and the model would animate accordingly as it interacted with the terrain, sometimes brokenly and spasmodically. The dinosaurs' AI would be significantly neutered after their moods would oscillate so rapidly they would be frozen in a state of perpetual indecision, which, to be honest, is something I can relate to. The engine was originally created without 3D accelerator support, but as their popularity and presence became unavoidable on the PC gaming landscape, support would be added in at the last moment, resulting in the software version looking better than the hardware accelerated one. The game was also made entirely in 3D Max, which came with its own set of problems. Although originally intended to be what is sometimes described as survival horror, as physics puzzles were scaled back and features were cut, the gunplay, already frustratingly awkward, was brought to the fore to fill in the gaps. Guns litter the island irresponsibly, like I imagine they would in some sort of failed state. The game would launch as a bad shooter with difficult controls and impressive physics, running poorly on computers at the time, but still permeated with rare flashes of brilliance. Since I have spoken overmuch on what could have been, it's time to explore those flashes of brilliance, in addition to the dinosaur-sized splashes of poop of Trespasser: The Lost World, Jurassic Park. Trespasser would be one of the early 3D games to adopt a WASD key configuration, though with separate buttons for run and walk. Complications arise from the mechanics of the much maligned arm. Through the use of the arm, you are free to manipulate objects within the world, each having its own weight and dimensions to consider, and with a variety of remappable buttons, you are free to independently move arm and wrist about the screen. Already there is a problem, as the need to even manipulate the wrist is questionable at best, if outright inadvisable, as it can ruin your aim, already compounded enough by the gun always being held out at arm's length, drifting anywhere over the screen. Though there's a satisfying tactile substantiality to needing to duck and stretch out your arm and close your fingers around a thing to pick it up, as you move around the terrain, problems also arise as the carried object, again always held at literal arm's length, is often pulled from your hand whenever it bumps into something. This is somewhat mitigated by being able to stow one weapon at a time, but you'll always want to still be carrying a gun in a free hand, owing to how easy it is to miss and to the fact that there's no reloading. Your character moves through the world picking up, switching and dropping weapons, kind of like it's a John Wick movie. Of course, you'll never become as proficient as John Wick. Let's demonstrate your typical encounter with one of the game's numerous raptors. If all goes well, you put the raptor down in a couple headshots. The game was an early adopter of location-specific damage. You don't consume too much ammo and you can go about your day. More likely though is you miss your shots. Now your only recourse is to turn to being a dino toreador, strafing at the right moment and getting enough distance to try and line up some further shots. As you try to avoid the attacks, however, your gun will inevitably catch on something and be wrenched from your hands. Then it turns into a hilarious game of trying to grab a shotgun from between a raptor's legs, like a grabby middle-aged woman drunk at a bachelorette party. It's worth mentioning this one time this happened to me and a raptor tripped on a gun and ended up inside its own rectum. Your only other option is to run, and though there's some thrill in being chased, escaping usually relies on engaging with some clumsy physics-based solution. As mentioned in the opening, it was originally intended for the dinosaurs to have a more sophisticated behavioral system, but when that failed, the solution was to set their aggressiveness to max. I think I sometimes saw dinosaur species attacking each other unscripted, although white woman always seems to be at the top of every carnivore's meal list.
Yeah, single white female.
Still, sometimes it seems as if there's a little more going on than suggested by what I had read. Inflicting pain on a raptor does appear to drive them away for a short distance before they return again. Herbivores seem to try to chase you off before losing interest, I think. Oftentimes, any illusion of intelligence is crushed as you stand on a rooftop and watch raptors stumbling around like drunks on ice skates. There are actually about 20 different guns in Trespasser, from machine guns to rifles and pistols to tranquilizer guns, which gives some indication of how much combat plays as part of the game, which, as explained, is a very precarious foundation indeed. In fact, precariousness itself can be a weapon sometimes.
Looks like a ghost or a puff of smoke.
But there's really only a handful of similar cases, and they always have to be lined up perfectly. The rest of the game is taken up by keycard hunts, the odd traversal puzzle, or using the physics system to knock down crates and use them as a step to higher ground. One of the things I do love is the diegetic UI, with damage reflected by a heart tattoo on your plump bosom that fills with colour. Health is actually regenerative, atypical for a time in which first-person shooters almost universally adopted health packs. The shift away probably owes to modern design aversions to placing the player in a situation they can't win. Previous games like the Terminator games I have previously reviewed even sometimes had places you could fall from which you can't escape. Trespasser doesn't appear to fall for this sort of amateurish trap. In the vanilla game, I can't say there were any times I was stuck, unless specifically looking for something, and in general level design is pretty good. A small aside, I played through on the community patch Trespasser 2020, which gave me the closest experience to a fully patched retail version. It's worth mentioning various mods that introduce new scenarios or tweak mechanics. One of my favourites of those I tried was Xeno's fan build. Not only did I seem more capable of murdering a raptor with a melee weapon, but also standing over and watching its death cries carry on for sometimes uncomfortable spans of time is pretty neat.
I'm fine. Oh God. Who would have thought that I could do that?
It also restores some lost content. It's probably the best experience of what Trespasser has to offer, and if you're willing to overlook the game's other faults and actually play it, there's a standalone version available freely on ModDB. The following contains locational and visual spoilers. If you'd like to skip ahead to my thoughts, go here. Our story is set a year after the events of Lost World, when Dr. John Hammond's nephew tries to outdo his uncle's characteristic hubris by almost allowing a T-Rex to escape onto the US mainland from the secret dinosaur breeding facility, the island known as Site B. Though the Lost World movie ends with a CNN news segment about the events, the manual describes the public as skeptical, even after the published memoirs of InGen's founder details every step of the project. When you begin a new game, there's a short cutscene to set up a brief backstory of an empty home and a message left by a friend, revealing your name as Anne and placing your location as on holidays in Costa Rica, before cutting to the scene where you throw up in the toilet just before the plane goes down. You wake on a beach after a loading screen. As tranquil as the beach is, your left arm is injured and you need to find a way to signal for help. Up ahead are some structures that, on closer inspection, turn out to be concrete foundations, suggesting there might be civilization somewhere on the island. And with civilization, perhaps a means to effect rescue. Some wood, some items to knock over, a target range, and some guns give you the chance to familiarize yourself with the game's controls in relative safety before proceeding. As you clamber over a fence and onto a main dirt path, you are greeted by a billboard detailing site development plans belonging to a certain InGen. Your brain starts up an inner monologue as the name stirs some memories.
InGen? Some kind of... Wait. International Genetic Technologies. That was the company from the dinosaur trial. After the trial, that old guy, John Hammond, wrote a book. He said it was somewhere in Central America.
My name is John Parker Hammond. I was born on March 14th, 1928.
From here on, the voice of the great Sir Richard Attenborough as Dr. John Hammond adds to the ambience by reading lines from his memoirs, Jurassic Time, winding back the years to the exciting inception of the whole program. The realization hits Anne with horror as she remembers.
Oh no. Oh God. This is Site B. This is John Hammond's Lost World.
You have only so much time to contemplate the danger you are in when you're confronted by an awe-inspiring callback to the original Jurassic Park movie. Brachiosauruses grazing from the treetops, their ponderous footsteps causing the ground to tremble. As you clamber over the path, you come across the first of what will be one of the game's most numerous enemies, raptors. You'll learn soon enough that it's uncommon to find them hunting alone. After what may be an awkward struggle, you assert dominance, as per law of the jungle, and move on. What looks like an unfinished monorail allows a safe approach over the heads of snapping raptors, and you find yourself on an overgrown jungle path. When you escape the dense brush, you find yourself in the presence of the king of the Cretaceous, a T-Rex in pursuit of raptors. He looks kinda goofy, like he's top-heavy, body bent, mouth open, with the weight of it dragging him forward and his legs just trying to keep up. If you don't attract too much attention, you can skirt around and into a canyon, which appears to be a raptor lair. Amidst the rocks and discarded bones is a crashed biosyn helicopter, supposedly a reference to a competing genetics company who attempted to steal InGen's secrets in the novel. At the top of the cliff, you take an Assassin's Creed preempting leap of faith from a waterfall and into a pool with its bank on an open expanse with a parasol, some raptors, and a prowling Albertosaurus bullying the smaller prey. There's also a rather convenient but awkward to use mounted machine gun located nearby. Further along the path is a crashed plane, and nearby, behind an invisible barrier, the monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey looks on. Pursued by raptors, you climb over a fence to find yourself in front of the walls of a settlement. Some larger buildings loom over the walls, including a church bell tower. The place looks abandoned, but there might be a way to signal the outside. This reveals itself to be the InGen working village of Burrows. Dr. Hammond's lavish mansion and the church have the appearance of dating back to the island's conquistador past, distinguishing them from the numerous gutted or unfinished cookie-cutter modern worker apartments littering the town. Faded frescoes adorn the ceilings of various rooms in Hammond's impressive home. The ceiling painting in the master bedroom features Andrea Pozzo's Triumph of St. Ignatius, showing the ascent of the founder of the Jesuits into the heavens. In the study is Giovanni Battista Gaudi's The Worship of the Holy Name of Jesus, from the Church of Jesus, the mother church for the Jesuits in Rome. Finally, the bathroom features Apollo in his sun chariot driving Beatrice to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, found in the palace at Wurzburg, Germany. The last one is an interesting choice in a mix of pagan and secular imagery, although all seemingly share a common theme of peering into the heavens and witnessing some sort of ascent. A reflection of Hammond's hubris, or a foreshadowing of something. Directly across from the antiquated building is the more modern gated home of Chief Geneticist Dr. Henry Wu. complete with pool and all the modern conveniences. On the other side of the compound, the operations center provides a visual link to the same location in the movie, though the areas are otherwise drastically different. After leaving the town, you pass two T-Rexes fighting over a parasol. I chose to quietly throw them a bon appetit, bid them adieu and go about my business. As you climb to the top of a dam, a mountain looms above you. The height is impressive. As you move about the path, you pass by InGen's docks, still containing warehouses full of boxes. A T-Rex causes the windows of the nearby offices to rattle as you explore for a keycard for the next area. The walled-off area housing the labs appears to be untouched since the scientists fled, giving the safety of a moment of quiet to climb through the windows, look through the records, and marvel at the modest setup needed to resurrect ancient giants. You see microscopes, centrifuges, eye and hand wash areas.
So this was all there was. Looks like a freshman science lab.
The centrifuge word night and day, the slow alchemy of genetic replication.
Nedry, the portly fellow who gets poison spit in his eye in the original movie, has his room here, along with a hint to the passcode to the lab's mainframe and a powerful melee weapon. If you want, there's a mod that lets you play as Nedry called eStock on trescom.org. Once you boot up the mainframe, it fails to connect to a satellite, redirecting you instead to some hope that might be found on a mountaintop facility, and you recall the massive mountain you witnessed earlier. It's a long way up. Raptors stalk Mesoamerican ruins that dot the landscape on the ascent. As the terrain gives way to rocky cliffs, you do your best to find your way over sections of eroded path. Packs of raptors have made their home at the top of a communications facility. Breaking in, you send out an SOS and make your way ever higher, past another raptor pack on the hunt, and over some boxes and finally onto a landing to be airlifted to safety.
Come on, son. Get us out of here.
I'm leaving you. I'm sensing some sort of pattern here. Come on, Ann, quit being the antisocial and pick up the phone sometime. Oh, and by the way, don't even bother calling me unless you have a damn good excuse.
And there we have it, The Lost World, Jurassic Park Trespasser. The game's plot is no more complicated than it needs to be, propelled by a simple goal to escape the island. But the game succeeds wonderfully in using that to tell the larger story of the Jurassic Park world. Some of this through Dr. Hammer's memoirs as he tells the story of InGen's own journey through his nostalgic recollections. To a lesser extent, Anne's comments also provide a pensive lens through which to observe the island. The developers actually recorded additional voice lines where she spoke more about herself, but likely there was a conscious decision to give her less of a personality, probably to allow players to project more of themselves onto her without wanting to commit fully to a silent protagonist. The game's jungle and its overgrown winding paths through ruins, engineering projects, and other structures also provide Trespasser's strongest supporting character. When Trespasser launched, some reviews commented positively on the impressive open expanses of the game, unrivaled in first-person shooters of the time, although criticism was also given for aggressive pop-in. It also wouldn't skimp on the smaller details, and would be one of the first 3D games to use bump mapping, giving dinosaur skins the appearance of scales with a sophisticated lifelike quality, with the first sometimes considered to be Montezuma's Return, though papers had been written far earlier describing the technique. Thanks to community efforts, Trespasser now looks the best it ever has been, with vast environments that feel almost modern in their scale, and dinosaurs with believably textured skins who, at their best moments, when they aren't tripping over each other, dart about in a believable fashion across the terrain. There's incredible attention to detail in the environment. Rusted vehicles and the bones of victims whose identities have been lost to time are scattered about the overgrown jungle. The foundations of unfinished buildings are amongst the first things to greet you, but through dense jungle are the remnants of the island's history. Indigenous ruins, the beautiful decaying houses of another era, and the dilapidated structures of the more recent past. Abandoned offices and worker shacks are all believably furnished, including what now has become for this channel something of a convenient yardstick for a commitment to immersive simulation, the humble toilet. I'm starting to collect these like postage stamps. When it all comes together, it's incredibly impressive for a game of its time, and remarkably modern, until of course, something goofy happens or something glaring becomes impossible to ignore, shattering the illusion. The other thing worth noting is the visible presence of your character's body, something I've always liked in games, as it gives a sense of substance to the space you occupy. And this is combined with another feature I've always loved, the diegetic user interface. There are drawbacks in the method used here, like the need to look down to check your health, though one could argue it regenerates fast enough not to care. The original development plans were to have your health always visible on the arm itself, but for whatever reason this couldn't be achieved. A different but similarly annoying problem is in the game's approach to ammo count, in which you need to either shoot or swap weapons to find out how many bullets are left in the mag, as Anne announces the remaining bullets. But that's no fault of an incredible use of audio, which I'd consider a massive success. Minnie Driver would be the voice of our protagonist Anne, and she does an incredible job as a British voice actress who plays a slightly sardonic but often awestruck young American woman.
I knew all along this was a stupid idea. They're probably out drinking right now. Anne who?
As she journeys about the island, Richard Attenborough's narration peels back the ravages of time in describing the first exciting days of InGen's revolutionary project, reading out the lines from his fictional memoir, Jurassic Time.
There must have been something in the memoir.
A Nobel Prize or a financial empire waits somewhere in a darkened room, in a dirty, derelict building, somewhere in the Pacific.
Many of these voice lines would be cut from the game, but still exist, and the full 26 minutes of Dr. Hammond's narration forms a compelling story and a treat to listen to all by itself.
And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains.
Sound design is also an incredible accomplishment, rivaling its contemporary Thief in the way footsteps change as you move across different surfaces. But it goes beyond that with what's called by the developers a real-time Foley system, combining multiple sound effects at different volumes to simulate the interaction of different materials being struck with different force. It works incredibly well. To avoid the additional licensing costs of the original John Williams Jurassic Park score, the developers would instead turn to Bill Brown, who has now had a prolific career creating music for games, TV and movies. Evoking a similar sort of mood to the movie series, these tracks consist mainly of orchestral numbers, sometimes with a sharp trill of a flute or the beating of a frame drum to give a primal air. And although beautifully executed, most are around 1 minute or less, short enough only to serve to introduce a scene or ornament an encounter. I would by no means consider Trespasser a good game, but it definitely has moments that inspire a sense of awe and wonder. What interests me most is the questions it provokes in regards to what we really expect from a game. When it launched, Trespasser would be dismissed as a tech demo, the common term for a game whose gameplay suffers for the sake of some technology, either an actual novel technology or some sort of gimmick or even just a graphical advancement. Even the Moby Games trivia section currently reads, "This game proved that technology didn't cause gameplay," which is a strange assertion which I think no one actually made. Doesn't really even make sense, like saying this book proved how the pen didn't cause the story. In any case, developer Seamus Blackley's pre-release interviews insist the game was designed in service of fun, and this was the metric by which they judged whether the features of Trespasser made the cut. Despite this, Trespasser's gameplay experiment still comes up short, even if they tried their best, and from all indications, like a hungry fledgling dinosaur, they bit off more than they could chew. I'm not fond of cliches like ahead of its time. In many ways, this game is of its time, of the mid to late 90s when the advancement of technology opened up new avenues for untested ideas. And it's no surprise that the developer interviews mentioned their formative years with Looking Glass and their inspiration found in overlapping and intersecting systems. For all its commercial and sometimes critical failures, it's a design philosophy I still personally appreciate because it brings about entirely novel experiences that defy and subvert expectations. For example, the way the environment is hostile in System Shock and Prey, or Thief's relatively feeble, more Cockian anti-hero, or a particular event involving your brother in the original Deus Ex. As much as they are praised, these games would never be massively popular. Terrified of failure, the market would be dominated by what might be called more formalist approaches to game design. We are now immersed in a tradition of familiar genre expectations, with the most diversity found in a cross-pollination of features between these genres. This is not intended as a criticism, but an observation. It represents a certain maturity of the media to have highly developed genres and deeply ingrained traditions. These games stick to the same thing because they work, and their pleasures are easily accessible. I procrastinate a lot, and these easy modern pleasures are often where you find me procrastinating. For example, in Darktide with simple controls, yet very visceral combat. In the past, I've also spent a considerable amount of time in convoluted space sims like Elite Dangerous, although their controls have always made them intimidating to pick up and sometimes a challenge to even return to. Trespasser just doesn't offer the same cathartic payoff for engaging with its systems, and definitely not the same sort of depth you'd expect from an actual sim. All of your efforts are spent getting your own arm under control, and the only actual payoff is being able to shoot straight. It's worth remembering some of the things Trespasser gets right. First, I think something like a diegetic UI is still an elegant piece of design for which to strive, a beautiful piece of ludic consonance. Dead Space would use it to much better effect later, but very few other games actually tried. The other thing I think Trespasser does right is in its realism. Outside of the shaky-legged dinosaurs and the impressive physics engine are decently designed levels with impressively large areas that funnel you towards your next location. There's an attention to environmental detail, very naturally unfolding terrain, and a level design that feels thoroughly modern. Further, having a visible character body isn't just an unnecessary visual addition, it helps situate the player within the virtual environment, giving substance to the space you occupy. And it will be used to much better effect later in games like Mirror's Edge to give an increased sense of motion. Had Trespasser launched running smoothly on people's computers, without having to fight your own arm, playing instead as a more traditional FPS, would it have succeeded? I don't know. It was only a couple of months later that Half-Life would launch, a game that was critically praised from its very opening scene, a humdrum tram ride that was both understatedly naturalistic while being cinematic. But then much later, Gabe Newell would cite Trespasser as an inspiration for Half-Life 2's physics. And of course, Half-Life 2 would lead to Portal, a game that stands entirely on its one simple mechanic by the strength of its strong design. Had it failed, the charge of tech demo could just as easily have been leveled at that. Maybe just as in the setting of Jurassic Park, some hubris is to blame for Trespasser's failure. There's a thin line between masterpiece and masturbatory piece. But perhaps it might be said Trespasser died so Half-Life 2 could live.
Are these even legal?